So just somebody hit the recording. Okay. A few administrative issues. The next meeting is going to be November 9th, and our speaker is going to be Bob Knight. And Sal, is there anything we want to talk about, Bob? He hasn't mentioned the topic yet, but he will be the speaker. And so everybody's on mute and put your questions in the chat, but because I'm also the speaker, I might not get to them. Hopefully the talk will be about 45 minutes. After the talk, I'll answer all questions that come up. So on that note, first I'm going to share the screen. And there we are. And also we're on record. So I'll get started. So my presentation is Women in the Great War. And the question actually comes up, why did I pick this topic? And the first issue I had is I always grew up with very strong, powerful women. In fact, my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, graduated Syracuse University in 1902, and my father wasn't often in the picture, so my mother really carried the load. So I've always looked at strong women, and also many of you know me as an author of World War I thrillers, and in writing one of my books, I came across the Hello Girls, and I have a character in one of my books is a Hello Girl who's really a fascinating character, one of the most fun characters I've actually written. I think you enjoy her. And then I remember way back, Vera Brittain in Masterpiece Theater, Testament of Youth, was the first exposure I had to women nurses. So always a topic that's close to my heart, and let's get started. So there are 25,000 women. I apologize, I'm a former CPA, so people get a lot of statistics. Worked in France during World War I. Where did they work? They were nurses, occupational therapists, clerical workers, telephone operators, war correspondents, others. And the ones I starred are the ones we're going to focus on. And 1 million American women joined the workforce during the war. Factories were the largest employers. And this is actually quite important because it affects World War I and World War II. The Anglos, so that would be the Americans and the Brits, their women came to participate more in the war effort than anybody else. Obviously, in World War II, we were talking about it earlier, the Soviet women participated everywhere in the factories, even on the front lines. But in World War I and II, the Anglo women really contributed a lot, made a big difference, and their contribution cannot be overstated. So, one of the interesting things about women is, their whole contribution is totally not certainly underappreciated. So let's go on. And in order to talk about World War I nurses, I want to go back a little bit in history, really to the US Civil War. So Clara Barton, everybody knows her from the US Civil War, and how things changed on the battlefield and how battlefield nursing changed. One is just the total scope of the battlefield area. So, for instance, at Gettysburg, the largest battle in the US Civil War, we had maybe 170,000 men on the field and they fought for 3 days. By World War I, the size of the armies were in millions. The size of the battlefield were the tens of miles. The weapons used were completely different. Artillery, poison gas, machine guns. And the nature of the wounds really became, just utterly horrific. So let me talk about that for a second. In the Civil War, 90% of the battlefield wounds were what I call horizontal. So the bullets were just, they were horizontal because they were shot from the gun. So the wounds would enter the body horizontally. By World War I, things had changed enormously. So the wounds are 360. Head wounds, people would step on mines, so the legs would be blown off. The nature of the war just changed enormously. And one of the things that's actually interesting is the development of nursing in the Anglo countries was very much advanced over everybody else. And that's really due to the US Civil War, Clara Barton, and the war against Russia in whatever it was, the Crimea War. And so we had really advanced nursing. We'd seen a lot of the battlefield changes. The Franco-Prussian War didn't last long enough for Germany to really develop nursing. And over time in history, we had medical advancements. In the Civil War, if you had a gut shot wound, most likely you were going to die. If you got hit in a limb, the only thing to save the life was amputation. So wound care, we had a better idea of disinfecting, medicines, everything really changed radically in the 70 years, 60 years before. A couple of statistics. US medical teams arrived in Europe in May 1917. Just to put it in perspective, we joined the war in the beginning of April 1917. So our medical people were probably the first US soldiers army that we sent over. And 23,000 professional trained women served in the US Army during World War I, 10,000 on the Western Front alone. The US Navy had 1,500, and there were more across 8,000 in the Red Cross. In fact, 18 African American women served stateside. They did not get overseas. And a number of American women served in British-run hospitals, Belgian hospitals, all over. And in fact, they died. 265 women died in France from influenza, other diseases. 3 were wounded from shell fire. So let's move on. And let's see, where did they work? They worked actually everywhere. Again, they worked in the armies of the British, the French, Belgians, Red Cross. They worked in Italy. Some actually probably worked in Russia. They worked in surgical teams, hospitals, ambulances, field hospitals. They were everywhere. Wherever the soldiers were, so were the nurses. And what I want to start doing is take you stage by stage from the point when somebody is wounded in the front line to treatment. So what happened is, if you're wounded on the battlefield in no man's land, you were really left there until somebody could come and get you. If the unit was retreating, they could take you back, but often men stayed on the field, wounded, bleeding, dying. So if you were wounded, 1/3 of them died before they had a chance to get treatment. And some of these men were staying in no man's land for days. The smell of the battlefield was absolutely horrible because they couldn't get to the men to bury them, both sides. But once you were recovered, you were first taken to a field dressing station. They did basic treatment, triage, and then they moved to what's called, the English and the Americans use this, a casualty clearing station, CCS. And they were triaged, and mostly the nurses did the triage and stabilized. And this was an interesting statistic I picked up along the way, is that the French triaged differently. What the Americans and the British did is we treated the most badly wounded people first. The French didn't do that, and I'll explain why. Is the French treated the most easily cases first. And why did they do that? They did that because they needed to get the men back on the front line as fast as they could. So as a result, more French soldiers died, but that was the choice the French army had. Just it was so important to get the men back to the field. And then this is a horrible term, but it was the term that was used. The dying men, people who knew they were going to die, were moved to a moribund area, and they were just left to die because they couldn't be treated or we didn't have the resources to treat them. Those that continued to live, they were trucked to a field and then a base hospital a few miles away from the front lines. And that's where basic surgery amputations were performed. And then ultimately to field final hospitals back, in Bridie and England or wherever it was. But there was a whole, almost a station by station process for when you were wounded to when you were finally treated or died. So this is a quote, and what the nurses went through is just some of the emotionally jarring experiences. I can't even imagine it. So, quote, "You can see death written in most of their faces," from a nurse. "They realize to the full great pressure you were working at, yet the thirst is so intense, they gasp with an apology for a drink. Yet with it all, every man's face wears a look of content or resignation. He waits his turn and never asks," unquote. The courage these women faced, I cannot just overstate. And one of the things that's actually very important to know on all armies is these men and the women were very religious. Religion was a part of how they fought, why they fought, and how they continued to face death. And Civil War was like that, and it certainly continues. Religion was a big part of the makeup of the soldiers and the nurses. I do not know how they could survive it without religion. So let's just look at some of the wounds they suffered. And as I was saying, the wounds would go from head to toe. One of the reasons they came up with helmets was because of shrapnel. In World War I, 60% of all battlefield casualties were artillery. And if you are near an artillery shell that explodes, often there's nothing left of you. Now, one of the things is if you don't remember anything else about this talk today, you will remember this, the term basket cases. We know it slightly differently, but it's a World War I term for men who suffered the loss of 4 limbs in battle. Quadruple amputees were called basket cases. It's almost frightening to even see how the term has changed over time. These explosions would tear people's heads apart, faces. I don't know if anybody remembers the movie, Broadwalk Empire, and one of the characters was a man who had lost half his face and he wore a mask. Organs ruptured. So if you have an explosion, your internal organs will just shatter. So there are men just lying dead, and you can't tell that they were injured except for all the internal, injuries they suffered that were just critical. Going through an artillery barrage is just something I can't even imagine. And what that did is it turned men into shells of themselves, the term shell shock. We know it differently in terms of post-traumatic stress. But that was the term they used, shell shock. And these people were just horribly emotionally distressed. If you see pictures of some of these men, they just have a distance and a stare that almost is not human. 31 of the AEF, that'd be American Expeditionary Forces casualties, were poison gas. And here's a quote from a nurse: "It's hellish. His body is literally scorched nearly black all over, while some parts, for example, legs and arms, face and neck, are a mass of blisters, end quote. And I want to talk just a little bit about mustard gas, because mustard gas was the gas that was probably the worst that was used in the war. And mustard gas is heavier. And so what happened with mustard gas is if you were subjected to a mustard gas attack, the mustard gas would rest on your uniform. And if it was cold, it was inert. But the real danger came in is if you moved inside where it was warm, the mustard gas would release itself. So if you were exposed to a mustard gas attack, you actually had to clean yourself off before you sought shelter. And the Germans combined poison gas with regular artillery. It got to be a real horrible combination. They faced typhus, dysentery, trench foot. One of the things soldiers always wanted were socks. Sores, blindness. Blindness often came from poison gas. And the nurses, just physical exhaustion. Some of these men were in the front for 2 weeks straight. And just the conditions that they had, the sanitary conditions were just horrible. So I just can't even imagine what World War I was like. And I've tried to write about it to the best I can. So again, I want to take it to another quote from another nurse, and this comes from a book, Anzac Girls, Extraordinary Stories of World War I Nurses. Quote, "Heartbreak in the ward was common and death frequent. An 18-year-old had a fractured skull from which shrapnel was removed. I was in the middle of writing a letter to his mother when he began to sob, great tears running down his face. About 10 minutes later, he stopped breathing," end quote. And the nurses faced this all the time. They were talking to people. There are stories of men whose faces were blown off, and they're wondering to the nurse whether the wife will ever talk to him again. Will he ever be a normal person? Emotionally draining is an understatement. So things haven't changed all that much in terms of the obstacles they faced. Prejudice, just physical endurance, and mental issues. So the prejudice we know, social, merit, arrogance, professionals, often the officers would look down on the people. The US Army didn't even assign females a rank. The Navy did. So they were really treated as second-class citizens, despite the fact of everything they were doing. And what they did is often in a big push, they'd work 16 hours straight. One hospital, 70 nurses cared for 5,000 patients. It's almost unbelievable. They had to deal with infection. Lice was rampant. Rats were everywhere. Even on rats on the battlefield became 2 feet long. And the rats were probably the winners of World War I. The rats did very well during war, and cold. There was no lighting. It was always a problem. And again, these women overcame it. They had no privacy. The conditions they had were very basic, totally uncomfortable. They still had to listen to military discipline and bureaucracy and all the other prejudices they faced. They had a really tough task in terms of performing their duties. And one of the big problems they had is lack of resources. There was little water for cleaning or clean water. Washing was a problem. Getting clothes, anything close to reusable was an issue. Supplies, and World War I made a lot of companies very rich. Johnson & Johnson's one of them. And this is kind of interesting, is Kotex was originally developed for wound care. Johnson & Johnson came up, they were highly absorbent bandages. And the nurses got a hold of these things and said, we have another application for this. And that's how the development of Kotex as a business product came about. Hard to find clean blankets, sheets, medicine was often scarce. There were not enough staff, and a lot of them learned on the job. They had very basic training. Probably the British and the Americans had the better training, but even that was iffy. And Vera Brittain is somebody, I'm cheating here, folks. I talked about women in World War I as Americans. Vera Brittain's a Brit, but she is probably the best known woman who participated in the war. People might know her book, Testament of Youth, which was considered the best written book of a woman who participated in World War I. BBC did a television production of it a long time ago. There was a recent movie starring Alicia Vikander, which I would highly, highly recommend. She was a middle-class woman. She was highly intelligent. She went to Oxford, but she said the educational experience didn't mean anything. Her brother was off to war. Her lover was off to war. Education didn't seem right. She wanted to participate. So through a lot of effort, she got her nursing training. And because she spoke German, she also was a nurse for captured German wounded soldiers. It is a wonderful story. And after the war, she and Aldous Huxley were very much part of the pacifist movement. Never again. We have to avoid anything like this ever. And after the war, she wanted to share her experiences in the war. Nobody wanted to know about it. Move on. And she just didn't. She's a really remarkable character and deserves a lot more attention than she gets. And from the American side, the most important and the most highly decorated was Madeline Hancock. And she was known as Old Glory Hancock. And why is that? She wore the stars and stripes on her uniform. She was a really interesting lady. She grew up in Florida, went to nursing school in New York City, married an English officer. And so when the war started on the British side, she joined in. So she was part of what was known as Dr. Monroe's Flying Ambulance Corps. And what that did is the ambulance corps, they were in trucks, and whenever there was a need for frontline nursing injury, they would move from one area of the battlefield to another. And because she worked for the Belgian army, the British army, and the French army over the ways, never worked for the US Army, oddly enough. She's the most highly decorated woman of World War I, and really a remarkable character. She faced just horrible, life-threatening situations and came through with it. Very, very interesting lady. And some other notables, and I've got to watch my time. Beatrice McDonald lost an eye, was given the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 others did. That's like the second highest honor that the US Army can bestow on somebody. 28 women received the Distinguished Service Medal. Julia Tralfib was the first woman to receive the French Croix de Guerre. They gave out 28 of them later. The chief nurse of the US Army in France, the Red Cross, Julia Simpson. Sophie Gran was an anesthetist and became the first president of the California Association of Nurses, 1931. And the first 2 women to die in the line of duty were Edith Ayres and Helen Wood. And what happened is they were on a troop ship, and there were some gunnery mishaps, and they were killed by an explosion nearby. First 2 women to die. Now, this is something that I came across that was very interesting, and I'm going to spare you trying to sing it because you don't want to hear my voice. But there was, in fact, a song about American women during the war, and it's called The Rose of No Man's Land. And let me read it. There's a rose that grows in no man's land, and it's wonderful to see. Though it's sprayed with tears, it will last for years in my garden of memory. It's the one rose the soldier knows. It's the work of the master's hand. In the war's great curse stands the Red Cross nurse. She is the rose of no man's land. And even if the women were not appreciated overall, the soldiers that interacted with them, the men she saved, they knew how totally valuable the nursing contribution was. So, on that note, the second part of my talk deals with women war correspondents. And it's interesting, when I was doing the research for this talk, which of the three components of my talk was most interesting for me. And it turns out, and I was surprised by this, by women war correspondents. I had known about Hello Girls because I had researched it and included one in my novel. My mother actually was a Red Cross war poster girl for World War II. But the war correspondents are really interesting, and they really changed a lot of things. And what they did, and this is the book on it, Unladylike and Unladylike Profession. And by the way, the movie came out just recently starring Kate Winslet and covers the story of a woman who was a photojournalist in World War II. And it's a really, really good movie. But what the women war correspondents did is they defined the Great War in terms of the impact on individual lives. They made it personal. Before, a lot of the talk might have been strategy, generals, all the big picture stuff. But the women really changed that. So in order to get into my talk, what I need to do is I want to turn the clock back a little bit. And I found this absolutely fascinating, is during the 1920s and the 1940s, there was what was called the American Renaissance. And I never had come across that term before. And what happened in America, there was an explosion of technology. The steam engine came around, the railroad, there was artistic expression, humanism, and intellectual thought. In fact, during those 20 years, they probably changed the country more than a lot of our technical social issues that we experience today. The country was dramatically changed in the 1920s through 1940s. Absolutely remarkable. Very much not understood. Probably a huge topic unto itself, not one I'm really prepared to give, but what happened is it had a huge impact on the reading public. America by 1840 was the third most literate country in the world. 89% of our population, non-slave, was literate. And in fact, if you include all the slaves, 78% was literate, which means that we had taught a number of slaves to read and write, which I was not aware of. The only countries more were Sweden and Scotland, and their literacy rate was like 98%. And I think by 1860, we caught up to them, excluding the slave population. And education just blossomed in America. By 1848, America had 113 state, private universities and colleges, including mine, Lafayette, my sister's at Mount Holyoke, and a number of these institutions were co-ed. And that is just a remarkable number for a country whose population was probably 20, 25 million people at most. So America really pressed education. And part of that was the growth of a reading public. The number of newspapers in America grew from 200 in 1800 to 3,000 in 1860. just 3,000 across not a huge population in terms of our populations of today. And this was interesting. By 1840, there were 148 million copies of newspapers that were circulated annually. 148 million. America consumed a lot of reading material, and that's very important for our talk today. So at the time, America really established its own literary base. We know the male authors Thoreau, Hawthorne, Poe, Douglas, Whitman, but also at the same time, female authors flourished. They staked their own ground. Louisa May Alcott, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Margaret Fuller, Elizabeth Peabody, Emily Dickinson. So they established themselves as popular, well-regarded authors. And that becomes important in the 20th century because women became a very important part of the consumption of newspapers, magazines. Ida Tarbell, who talked about muckraking in the oil industry, is sort of the link between the two. But women were consuming a lot of printed material. Money will often drive things. So as women readers increased, the publishers were looking to attract them with stories that related to other women. And that's how this whole industry is developing. And the Saturday Evening Post became the largest circulation magazine in the United States. And when the war broke out, they rushed two women to the front. They're going to get their readership, and they're going to use women authors, reporters to do it. So in terms of war correspondents, there are about 36 of them that we can identify. And what they did is they established a seat at a table for women journalists. Up until this point, there really were no women covering military situations. I know none about the US Civil War. And so often, these women came in and they wanted to talk about issues for women, and they expanded the audience as they started writing. People were more interested in what they said, and they had their own voice, they had their own opinion. People were reading their work, people respected them. And that's actually very important because that coincides very much with the women's suffragette movement. Women were starting to demand a place in society. They were willing to work for it, and they proved that they could do that. Again, we saw this with the nurses, and it was sort of the American pioneer spirit that the women in America always pulled their weight. They never shied away from work. It's something fairly unique. If you're in a covered wagon, everybody has to participate. If you're running in a farm, the women have to do as much work as the men, and they did. So let's just see, who were these women? Often they were women who had already established a professional career as fiction writers, newspaper columnists. People knew who they were. So when they started writing about World War I in columns, people would identify, oh, I remember so-and-so, I want to read her work. They were generally independently minded, very educated, and confident. Probably something that the country hadn't really seen before is a flourishing of women who knew what they wanted and were willing to work for it. Most of them were not married. They were older in general. And again, they had pretty much established themselves in their own careers before they moved into the war correspondent. Where did they work? Associated Press, Reuters, the wire services, newspapers, the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, everywhere. The magazines, we'd already mentioned the Saturday Evening Post, the Atlantic, Good Housekeeping. And again, their written work was everywhere, and it was consumed enormously. Many of them were freelance. They went over on their own. They wrote their own stories and they became syndicated colonists. And where did they work? Don't forget, America's a neutral country until April 1917. So, because they were a neutral country, they could work in the Central Powers. They worked all through the Western Front. They went to Russia, Italy, Turkey. They got to the front lines. They did everything the men did in many ways. And I want to just talk about their journey as reporters. I just mentioned, as America was a neutral country, they could go into the Central Powers, and propaganda in World War I became a very important issue. So every country was looking to make itself look as good as it could, even the Central Powers. So the Central Powers would invite these women in and try to give them a good story. We're not the beasts that you hear about from Belgium. Open up. Let us tell you so you can tell your American audience what's really happening. And at first, the women and what the reading public wanted were stories about other women. What's it like as a refugee to flee the war? What are the problems you have with your husband at the front, your husband dead, and you've got kids to feed? You're a refugee. What happens? How do women deal with that? And women back in the home front, what is it to work in a factory? They told these stories. What's it like to lose a husband? What's it like to suffer through all these other issues that you're dealing with? And that's originally what they started. And the women correspondents, often they weren't credentialed. They gained access by being something else. They'd act as nurses, canteen workers, and drivers. Because of that, they could get to the front closer, they could talk to the men, and they could get the stories. And if you were accredited correspondent, even as a man, you often didn't have access to the front lines. All the armies didn't really want the newspaper people so close. We even face that today. But the women were very clever, and they could hand out coffee or donuts to the soldiers moving to the front, see the men coming back. They'd go to the hospitals. They could talk to the people, the wounded people, and really get a better story than what the men came through. And we're talking about it. They humanized the war from a woman's angle, because what they started doing is they started talking about the whole story, not just women, but women as participants. And they took their literary experience as novelists and journalists to what I talk about. The story of one becomes the story of all. And what that means is, if you focus on one individual and tell that person's story, we can extrapolate beyond that. And it really changed how newspapers, how stories were told. And I think this is the fictional background. This is what interested me. And reporting ever since has been changed. Bruce Catton couldn't have written his Army of the Potomac trilogy without this focus. Cornelius Ryan, The Longest Day. What do? They pick a couple of soldiers' stories that are representative of the total, and through that, we can figure out what was going on. John Keegan's Face of Battle is particularly famous and had a huge impact on military historians. If you look at the individual, we can figure out what happens beyond. Every newspaper article we do, we even have today, always starts with, so-and-so, Mary Jones did this, and this is Mary Jones's story. And we can extrapolate it beyond, and we can understand what one person did and then understand how it affects everybody else. It's a different way of writing about stories that had been done in the past. And women were the ones that pioneered that. And I think a lot of it is their fictional background, newspapers, and they could really relate to an individual. I know as an author, people understand stories. And if you can give details in a way that people can remember them, they it's a very, very effective way of talking about a situation. And just a couple of others. Here's Mary Harris Reinhardt, probably the best known war correspondent. She was born in Philadelphia, trained as a nurse, had kids, and she actually became an author as well. And she was very widely read by the Saturday Evening Post. She had her own following by 1914. And when the Saturday Evening Post wanted to start writing stories on World War I, they sent her over. She was one of the first women over to cover the war. Again, America's neutral, and she was receiving VIP treatment from the French army. And again, all these countries wanted to show their soldiers the war in the best possible propaganda terms. And so they were given really carte blanche to see whatever they wanted and write in terms of details. And because she's an author, she had a very elegant, engaging writing style, and she received extensive coverage in America. And she continued to write even after the war. Probably the most important of the woman correspondents. Another one is Peggy Hull, who is probably the best known woman correspondent of World War I and World War II. She was born in Kansas. She started reporting locally in her local newspaper. Interestingly enough, she was part of Pershing's expedition to stop Pancho Villa in, I think, 1915-16. So she got very close to Pershing, which became very important when she was sent over to France. And she could go to Pershing and get access that a lot of other women couldn't, because Pershing knew her and respected her. And she would go around. She talked about a lot of different stories in France, human interest. And after the war, she actually covered the US soldiers who went to Siberia at the end of the war, as the Americans sent troops over to support the White Russians in the Russian Civil War. So we know her from that. And she was one of the founding members of the Overseas Press Club and covered World War II in the Pacific extensively. And again, this is really important, is what they changed the perception of women from women as victims to women as full and equal participants. And think about that. That has an impact in today's world. If you are a victim, you cannot be equal. And that's a big jump. And it's something I want to leave with you, is as long as you're a victim, people look down on you, you can never achieve equality. Something to remember for today. Now, other women correspondents, Nellie Bly, Eleanor Fagan, she was one that actually opened up the Armenian genocide by the Turks in the war. She was actually there with the Armenians, and she wrote extensively about that. And because of her, we know the most about that tragedy than anybody else. Mary O'Reilly went into the German lines as, again, a neutral country, and she could go through the lines, and she actually talked about the war from the Central Power point of view. Another Saturday Evening Post reporter was Retta Dorr, who really wrote stories of a mother's point of view. The soldier's mother in France. Very, very poignant, very well-regarded stories. Harriet Adams talked a lot about the French War. We know Louise Bryant, who together with John Reed reported on the Russian Revolution. It was 10 days that changed the world, and Edith Wharton was also a correspondent. So that's all I want to say. I think I'm doing okay on time. So I want to move over to Hello Girls. Who were they? They were telephone operators, and 233 of them served in France. Mostly they were young. And a quote, what were they doing? they established, quote, a fast and effective communication system that was part of paramount importance in the war effort and victory. And I feel our telephone operators contributed immeasurably towards this end. Quote from a hello girl. And what was the problem? Is because the battlefields were so huge, the Allied armies had three different armies, the British, the French, and the Americans, under a unified command with Foch. They had to communicate quickly, and you had to understand what was happening from the front line to division to army headquarters to Foch's headquarters. So they needed to move fast and cover a huge ground. You're talking almost hundreds and hundreds of miles of west front, and you needed to communicate with the three different armies, and they needed to do it in French because they had to patch into the French telephone system. We built our own systems. AT&T came in, and we ended up with the best front or communications between the armies of any of the other powers. They were highly trained people, and it was hard to find these people, and they had to move very, very quickly under really pressing conditions. And what they found is the men who were given these jobs initially, they lacked neither the discipline nor the deportment that was required for the job. The women were ideally suited for this type of work. And who were they? What were the skills they needed? You needed to be technically competent. You worked a rigorous training schedule. You had to be able to work the telephone network. You had to patch in. They were under enormous stress. Life and death situations mattered on how quickly they could get the communications from the front line to the battlefields. You had to think on your feet. Who needs this? How do I react? Who do I contact? How do I do it? They had to stay steady. They had to have mental discipline, and they needed to communicate well. Their English had to be good. Their French had to be good, and they had to be discreet. They actually had information that, if the Germans had, could have changed the war. So they needed to be trusted. And where did they came from? Actually, they came from all over the country, and even particularly the Quebecers, because they spoke French. You had to be fluent in French. Not that many were married, mostly were younger, as opposed to the women correspondents. And most of them had already had this job before. 42% of them had worked telephone lines before the war started. In America, because of where we were, had really comparatively a superb telephone network across the country. So we were able to reproduce that in France. So once they arrived in France, they worked wherever the AEF was, American Expeditionary Force. They were almost in the front lines, maybe 2 miles behind, maybe in battalion headquarters, all the way back. They worked 12-hour shifts, 24 hours a day. They never had a break. They had to handle 300 calls an hour. That was 6 times faster than the men handled. They worked under constant threat of German artillery. And in fact, in some cases, their equipment were actually shaking because the artillery shells were exploding so close around. Their conditions were what the men had. They were crowded. Sanitation was poor. They had primitive conditions, but they kept going and performed really an important service to the country. And the chief operator, the head of the Women's Signal Corps, was Grace Banker, and she was given the Distinguished Service Medal. Quote, "She served with exceptional ability by untiring devotion to her exacting duties. Under trying conditions, she did much to assure the success of the telephone service," unquote. She graduated from Barnard. She was trained by ATT. She was a suffragette herself, fluent in French. She was a wonderful leader and was really the most important of the telephone girls there. Now, what did they achieve? I think I'm doing okay on time. The Hello Girls were the first women to serve in any combat role in the US military in any capacity. And by combat role, what I really mean is somebody that was really close to the front. Again, they were really as close to the line. The nurses were as well, but the Hello Girls were the first women to serve in that capacity for the AEF. We had and Pershing had said this, we had the best telephone communications network among the Allies, far better than the British and the French. Our people were well trained, they were disciplined, they were intelligent, they were highly respected, they were respected by the top army commanders, and they were trusted as part of the whole military machine. And during their service, they handled over 3 million calls. 150 local calls per day were handled by the Hello Girls. And they broke stereotypes. They paved the way for women to become full members of the US Army, and really an important contribution that carried on into World War II. And really, I can't say enough about how important it was to get the information, to get the decisions communicated up and down. Before, you had to rely on dogs, carrier pigeons, but the telephone communication lines were really what was necessary for a modern army. And we had the best of them, no question about it. And they were very much ignored over a long period of time. And there's a big effort right now to give the Hello Girls a congressional gold medal. And in fact, the Senate has already passed this the Senate has passed, but the House needs to reconvene it on November 11th. And if I could ask you to take a few minutes to contact your representative and ask for his support of the bill to give these pioneering evening women the awards that they really deserved and worked for. Very important. Now, just in conclusion, I guess I'm doing okay. They were pioneers, no question about it. And because of their work, society changed. World War changed a lot of things. The role of women, I think, was part of it. They also changed expectations of who women were, what they could do, what they could endure, and they became recognized as trained professionals, skilled in their job, highly respected. Big change in terms of society. They were leaders. Women nurses were running surgical wards, they were running the communication centers, women were leading other women. They became formal members of the armed services, an important and recognized part of that. And they proved how valuable they were everywhere, every time. And the men who interacted with them recognized this. Some had prejudices, but when they were really honest with themselves, they said the women made a difference. And they learned how to be independent. They were respected for being independent people and not just housewives. Again, I go back, they were equals and not victims. They're no longer tied to their husband. They have their own lives. They have their own hopes. They have their own abilities. And they were, in many ways, part of the whole suffragette movement of the 19th century. But as we all know, equality and equal pay were still generations away, but they were the first. And just in conclusion, they helped win the war. All three of these areas, the Hello Girls militarily, the nurses saved lives, the nurses gave hope for the soldiers that if they were wounded, they were well cared for. And just as an end, and if anybody is interested, they can reach out to me, jlhockenberry@verizon.net, and I would be happy to send you the copy of the PowerPoint. And the last page on the is recommended reading. So the first book is The American Enlightenment, What Hath God Wrought? And that gets back to the American Renaissance that I was talking about. Vera Britton's book, Testament of Youth. You can read the others. I don't want to take any more time reading on that. And so that's the end of my talk. And I'd be more than happy to share any thoughts or experiences that you might have. Unmute yourself, and I'm here as long as the questions keep coming.
Well, Jim, let me say this. You've given a very moving and complete picture that is wonderful. I can't express enough the clarity and the depth in which you've done this research. So I hope everybody agrees. This is a brilliant presentation. I have a couple of things I'd like to ask you.
Sure.
One, you talked about the Civil War and back that. I understand there was a lot of unknown, or at least not recorded, how many of the victims of both sides in the Civil War died from disease rather than from battles.
Okay, this is an interesting point, and again, how battles changed from World War I back to the Civil War. In the Civil War, something like 2/3 of all the soldiers, both sides, who died of illness. And that's just the opposite. About 1/3 died, and that even includes the Great Influenza, which did ravage the soldiers on both sides. 1/3 died because of disease. So just the opposite. So medical practices, sanitation practices had really improved from the 1860s to the 1914s. And again, probably the Allied armies, the British and the Americans, were probably at the forefront. We were probably better at that than the Germans. And a lot of that is just the supplies, the equipment we had. The Central Powers armies by the end of the war were really lacking everything.
Thank you, Jim. Does anyone else have questions for Jim? Please come forward.
Hi,
Okay,
this is Linda. Hi, Jim, thank you for mentioning that Hello Girls Congressional Gold Medal. I posted a link in the chat. You can click on it, find out, click on your state, find out which women were from your state, which members have co-sponsored and which have not, and even gives you a little message you can cut and paste to your members. So we need at least 5 more in the House. We're that close. So please don't wait. They're out of session right now, which means they're back home in their districts, but they can still co-sponsor. So please join us in that effort. And thanks for covering this topic, Jim.
Thanks, Linda. That's actually a very important topic. They deserve this. They've been ignored for far too long, and they performed a very, very valuable service. Did Phyllis, you have a question? Or
no question. I just added some names and a couple of titles of books.
Okay, on the chat. Thank you. I see a hand raised by phone number 2. I don't know your name.
That's okay. This is Catherine Borgen. Jim, thank you very much for this lecture today. It was fascinating and all-encompassing, and I was very impressed and very pleased with your presentation on the Hello Girls. I'm a little bit particular, or I favor that a little bit more. And especially thank you, like Linda said, for mentioning the Congressional Gold Medal campaign. So we're really on the cusp of winning it. So it's quite exciting.
And I think we probably need to get it through this Congress before the new Congress takes place in January. So time is of the essence. And I'm sure these people come back after the election with a lot of other things in their mind. So let's
Well,
just,
the only thing they should have in their mind when we get to 290 is just to vote, do a suspension bill and vote and send it off to the president. And then they can worry about all the other stuff they have.
speed is of the essence, absolutely.
Yes, it is.
Dallas Horner here. I thought I would mention, I thought I would mention being a telephone operator was no easy job. And today's people would not know that because no one even most of you have probably never even seen a switchboard, but I worked in operator services in about 1975, and we had cord boards for long distance calls until about 1972. And the old gals would say, oh, these are a whole lot easier than they were. That the old gals who had worked in the 20s, who were still there, were saying that what we did, the calls came in and they would light up, and it was called taking a light, and you'd stick your cord in there and you knew what was coming in, and then you'd put your other cord up to into another hole, and you dial up the call for the person. But in the old days, these gals had to do something with the wires where they handed a wire to the next gal down the line, and she put it in. And I can't even imagine what they did on the battlefield. And we had equipment that worked all the time, and guys that would come and fix it if anything was wrong. I'm sure none of that happened out, if you're 5 miles from the battle line, to say nothing of being a mile away.
And shells are not exploding nearby.
But, right, and the wires were not, or literally laying on the ground. You read World War I accounts where they talk about that, and there'd be another battle, and they'd all be destroyed, and and the brass would need to get a hold of these people, so I mean it must have been very stressful.
Well, and you
It
had to
was a
think in two
stressful
different
job anyway.
languages. You had to think in 2 different languages and 300
Oh,
calls.
yeah.
I used to work a long time ago in the water company and near the call center. And, if they had 10 calls a day, obviously they were dealing with different issues, but 300 calls an hour is just astonishing how efficient you had to be. And the men were no good at doing this. And David,
Well, they couldn't.
Go ahead.
Men aren't taught to put up with crap. Women are, so that's why you choose a woman, and they will work for nothing. If you tell us we can go to France, hell yeah, I'll go. Where do I sign up? I mean that's but God and operator services was just nuts. God help you. You want to take a pee. You'd have to put what we used to call a P key light, and if you didn't, if we were real busy, they wouldn't answer that. Nah, you couldn't go. So it was, and it would have been horrible. I mean, we were doing it in the 60s and 70s. I mean, imagine what it must have been like for them in 1918.
Facing prejudice and a lot of contempt. I don't know how you did it, honestly.
Yep.
David Lang, you raised your hand?
Yeah, just a real quick note, a personal note. Many decades ago, I served in the U.S. Navy, and I was assigned on board the USS Higbee, which was named after Lena S. Higbee, who was, this was at the time, it was the only ship in the Navy named after a woman, and she was a World War I nurse. And in fact, she was the superintendent of the U.S. Navy Nurse Corps in World War I, and she was the first woman to be awarded the Navy Cross for her service. So I just wanted to throw that in as a personal note.
They did not receive the recognition they should have.
Yeah, oh, totally. We used to call the ship the Leapin' Lena. And being sailors, we had all kinds of very impolite explanations of how she got a ship named after her. But, that's what sailors talk about.
I'd like to say something too, Jim, is that women have reached the point now where they're running for presidency. So
Yeah.
that shows you how much we've moved on. And so it's just a fact of life that women are central to all movements.
Well,
Sure.
and you know, we've had Europe has had women prime ministers
Yes,
and
they have.
leaders of the country. We have one in Italy right now. I believe Estonia had a former woman who's now, I guess, a key member of the EU. They're invaluable and they bring a lot of different, issues to the front. Phone 2, you're raising your hand again.
Yeah, it's me again. I just thought I'd share this if you can see it. I don't know if the camera will take
Just
it.
hold your hand steady. Still a little blurred, but
Can you see it?
it's blurry.
No. Well, maybe because I blurred the background. I'll work on it and see if I can reshare it here in a minute. So give me a second. Sorry to interrupt.
It's all right. Maybe if you just put up to your face.
It's because I think I've blurred the background. So if I undo that, then I can share it again.
That's fine. Okay. We'll keep going.
Hey, Jim, this is Linda again. I see there were several women doctors who served in World War I. And I spoke with somebody at the Living History weekend after the memorial was dedicated. And she said that they were not, that the Army would not take them, even if they were practicing doctors and their hospital was sending a hospital unit to France. They wouldn't take the women as doctors. And so, and I wish I could remember her name, but she actually had to enlist in the Army as a secretary. And then once she got over there, she kind of worked her way into doing medical things. And I know there were women doctors who were contracted to work, but the Army wouldn't take them, the women, as doctors.
I think that's right. I think the British Army was a little different. I don't think the French Army was enlightened. There's a wonderful story about a New Zealand woman who was a doctor who worked for the Australian Army. This is important. And in the Australian Army, women who were Australian women were not allowed to be doctors in the Australian Army. But because she was a New Zealander, she was exempt from that and became an actual practicing doctor for the Anzacs, which I think was a good story. But again, that's what women face, the prejudices they faced. All I can say is the nurses took on more and more responsibility during the war. They were running triage. They just proved their worth, and doctors would outsource a lot of their work. Vera Britton's another case like that. Her story is just worth reading. Testament of Youth is a wonderful book. Do we have anybody else, or should we call it quits? It's getting on 3 o'clock, so I want to end this pretty quickly.
All right, Jim, I
Much
think
better.
you can.
That's much
I think
better.
you can.
Can-
Yeah, I think you should. There's a
Oh,
good
there it
picture.
is.
There it is.
Who is it?
Was the nurse that was
No,
Or-
this is my
Oh.
grandmother. She was in World War I in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. She was one of the Hello Girls in Unit 4.
God
All right.
bless.
Oops, I can't. It's hard
I
to
thought
do
I
this.
recognized that uniform. God bless. So on that note, I'm going to call an end to the meeting. The next meeting is November 9th. And thank you all for showing up. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the talk and have a good
Mhm.
rest of the fall.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
a well-developed and moving presentation.
Yeah, and thank you for your
Thank you.
kind comments, Sal. It's always a pleasure.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jim.